Good afternoon, everybody. It is so great to have you here today for the 2025-2026 academic year webinar series presented by BEAR, the Behavioral Economics and Action at Rotman Research Center. My name is Michael Boutros. I am an assistant professor of economics at the University of Toronto and a research fellow at BEAR. I'm very happy to be the moderator for today's webinar. We are very excited to have Nicholas Diamond from Impact Canada to show us some of his research today. Now, before I introduce him, I'll just quickly go over the ground rules for today's webinar. We're going to have Nick's presentation followed by a Q&A at the end of the session, time permitting. So throughout the webinar session, if you do have questions, you can click the Q&A tab at the top or bottom of your team screen, depending on your configuration, and type that question into the entry box. At the end of the talk, we will have a dedicated portion of time where Nick will go through those questions and we can have some back and forth discussion. So Dr. Nicholas Diamond is the Senior Lead of Behavioral and Data Science at the Privy Council's Office Impact and Innovation Unit. Prior to joining Impact Canada, Nick has his PhD in Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Toronto and then completed a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania. In his current role, he uses scientific and data-driven methods to improve policy programs and service delivery across the federal government of Canada. For example, he led a national multi-year program of research on Canada's information ecosystem, trust and institutions, and vulnerabilities in Canadian democracy, topics which are both timeless, but especially relevant in today's context. So we're very happy to have Nick here today. Without further ado, the floor is yours. Nick, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I will just fire up my presentation. Okay, so I trust that you can all see my screen. Somebody please shout if you can't. Okay, great. Getting thumbs up. So yeah, I'm here today to tell you about some of my team's work on behavioral science for federal public policy, democratic resilience, and trustworthiness. I want to say up front, a big thanks to the organizers. I'm a big fan of the Rotman Behavioral Economics group, so it's an honor to present here. And also in transparency, the invitation for this talk initially went out to my friend and colleague, Dr. Lauren Conway, Senior Lead of Behavioral and Data Science in the Impact and Innovation Unit. Lauren has happily just gone on parental leave, so the organizers kindly accepted me in her place. So just, as I'm talking, imagine that I'm like 30% smarter and more charismatic, and it will be as if Lauren is giving the presentation. So today I'm going to attempt to tell you a big sweeping story about a bunch of work from my team and from the broader Impact and Innovation Unit. I'm going to show you a lot of graphs. I want to say this up front. Probably too many graphs for a reasonable talk, but stick with me. And the story will go sort of as follows. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from in the Government of Canada and in PCO's Impact Innovation Unit. And then we'll get onto the data story and focus on the big question of trust institutions. So I'm going to break this down into 3 specific chapters. So first, I'll show you some data on where we are as a country in terms of trust in public institutions and trust in each other. And we'll move upstream and talk about the potential impacts of our digital information ecosystem. And then we'll close this section on focusing on citizen government interactions where trust is built. And then at the very end of the talk, I'll close on some applied evidence and experimental evidence to ask, what can we do about any of these problems in government and how can we earn trust? Okay, so who are we? Who am I? Well, I'm coming to you from the Privy Council office, as Michael mentioned in the kind introduction. Privy Council office, or PCO, is sort of in the center of the Canadian public service, and its role basically is to provide rigorous, nonpartisan policy advice. So being at the center means that we interact with policy from sort of across the entire federal government, not just one policy domain or another. And we essentially try to use outcomes-based approaches to improve policy outcomes for Canadians. So we have a bunch of work we do on outcomes-based financing, which I'm not going to focus on today. I'm going to focus specifically on our application of behavioral science to improve policy outcomes for Canadians. I'll say up front, being that this is the behavioral economics and action group, I'm going to gloss over the potential difference between behavioral science and behavioral economics, and not worry too much about definitions. But feel free to ask about that at the end. So how do we apply behavioral science in government? Very briefly, everything we do is anchored in good data. So this is data about Canadians' beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, changing priorities as they manifest out in the real world in Canada. We collect data in the form of massive nationally representative surveys, randomized controlled trial experiments, field trials out in the world, qualitative research, focus groups, excuse me. All of this is in the interest of challenging assumptions, informing decisions, and essentially making better policy decisions and better policy outcomes, rather. Sometimes this actually includes designing and testing different solutions and seeing what works at scale. We also do sludge audits, which I will touch on towards the end of the talk. So this has to do with measuring and identifying unnecessary frictions in government processes and basically trying to get those out of the way to make things work better and faster. A lot of the work is done by fellows in our fellowship program. So I want to highlight this up front. The Impact and Innovation Unit for years now. The unit, I should mention, was born in the Harper administration. And we've been running for years a behavioral science fellowship program that has attracted a lot of talent from the behavioral and social and data sciences, often folks with a bit of an academic background, but not necessarily, to come into government and to actually carry out this important work. That's how I came into the Impact and Innovation Unit. So I'm happy to talk about that if you'd like. And lastly, all of the work that I'm going to tell you about today stems from different discrete programs of research that we have with different partners across the federal ecosystem. So we've partnered with departments and agencies ranging from immigration to public health to climate to public safety, doing all sorts of different behavioral science work over the years. More recently, our partnerships have shifted in light of the new directions of the current administration, touching on topics like procurement, national defense, cybersecurity, and so on. So the vast majority of what I'm going to tell you about comes from one particular program of work that I've overseen with my colleagues that we call the Trust, Information, and Digital Ecosystem Study, or TIDES. What TIDES is essentially just a really big nationally representative survey series examining contemporary stressors on public trust and democracy in Canada and their impacts on Canadians and the way that they're interacting with public policy. This work is really broad and horizontal. It sort of falls in between the cracks of different departments and agencies. I see it sort of as like connective tissue across different departments in the federal government. It grew out of our earlier programs of research with specific partners like public health and climate, where essentially we were trying to understand what was driving policy successes and failures in these specific policy areas. And we kept finding that it was not policy specific behaviors or attitudes, but instead these really sort of big, broad attitudes people had about the government, about public institutions, about where they were getting their information that seemed to be really materially impacting policy outcomes. So we thought, we really need a program of work to understand trust in institutions and the information space per se, and the way that it's impacting everything. So we've been running TIDES since December 2022. And we've completed 9 waves of nationally representative data collection. Each wave has, give or take, 3,000 adults in it, aged 18 years and older. So we've totaled over 25,000 observations to date. It is, to our knowledge, the largest study of its kind in Canada. And so I'm going to begin the talk with a focus on just some data-driven insights from TIDES to set the scene here. Before I jump into all the graphs and all the data, I'll give you our sort of boiled down story from TIDES in a bit of a cheesy cartoon, so bear with me here. So let's say this is you. Often I'm presenting this to other folks in government, to public servants, but imagine even that you're a social scientist or an economist, and you're working on behalf of an institution, maybe a big public institution. And over here is the public that you're trying to either understand or deliver to, depending on your job. And that's what you do every day, right? Now, all of the work that you do is premised on assumptions that you have about the public. And of course, the public has assumptions about you and your institution. Now, the critical thing here is that these assumptions empirically might be right or they might be wrong. They might be more or less right. And there are some complicating factors. For example, there's no such thing as a public, really. If you go looking for the public, you won't find it. There's just a bunch of different individuals with extremely different priorities and values and experiences. They all have different assumptions about you and your institution, of course. And it's not just you sort of interacting with them or delivering for them. They're also talking to each other and may even be talking to each other about you. There are shifting social norms, changing sort of cultural milieu. And of course, you are competing for their trust or attention or whatever it may be with essentially infinite other competing actors, especially nowadays in our modern information ecosystem, effectively infinite competing messengers, some of whom are explicitly trying to undermine your goals, of course. So the key point here is that all of this can be thought of as like a prism through which all of your efforts might flow. What might come out the other side of this is a bunch of tangled up Christmas lights, a mix of intended effects, unintended effects, backfire effects, miscalibrated outcomes, so on and so forth. Apologies, this is seasonally out of touch now, but I did develop this around Christmas time. If anybody can think of a better visual metaphor, please let me know. But the whole point here is that, I'll stick to the case of a public servant, someone in government. You may have a policy intention. The policy outcome may be substantially different, and this is a common problem that we see. And so we see this sort of big empirical, rigorous data collection effort as a way to proactively try to bring the policy intention and the policy outcome closer together by anticipating some, unintended consequences. So let us now jump into the data story. And I'll begin, as mentioned, with a focus on where we are as a country and our changing landscape of public trust and priorities. So first, public trust in the government of Canada is dynamic. This is not surprising on its face, but I think it's interesting to sort of set the scene in the data. So we measure public trust in government in a number of different ways using a number of different questions and approaches. This is one overarching example we've used over time. So we ask folks in general, to what extent do you trust or distrust the federal government to make good decisions in the best interest of the public? Now, I want to clarify that before this, we define government, federal government, as the entire institution, including everyone that works for it. So we're not asking about one party or another. As nonpartisan research, we're asking about people's perceptions of the government as an institution writ large. And I'll cue your attention down here to this attitude of strong distrust in dark red, which we pay a lot of attention to. We know from the political science literature that strong distrust is a concerning attitude. It signals maybe, like alienation from our democratic process. It's not just lack of trust, but active distrust. And what we saw for the first few years of this survey series was that strong distrust was ticking up and up and up. So when we began the research in 2022, 1 in 4 adults said they strongly distrusted the whole government as an institution. And that sort of peaked a couple years later at 34%. So just over 1 in 3 adults. Now, interestingly, in sort of fall 2024, well before the last Canadian election, this trend started reversing course a little bit, with distrust coming down and trust coming up. And at the moment, we're sort of in a period of stability. I'll note that our most recent data point at this point is from November 2025. So about, roughly 5 months ago. And we'll be fielding another wave of tides in a month or two. So all of this will be updated. So we'll continue to pay attention to trust and distrust, because the point is we see distrust as almost providing a ceiling on public policy effectiveness. It materially impacts policy outcomes. Of course, the government is not one thing. People have different understanding and connotation of government. It's also a collection of all sorts of different organizations and entities and departments and agencies, and also related public institutions in the media, for example. And what we see when we break down different actors, entities, groups, and institutions is that trust is highly variable. So public trust always seems to be higher for more nonpartisan entities. So in this particular wave, we saw that public trust was highest for Elections Canada and poll workers, Also generally high for the sort of defense apparatus, Canadian Armed Forces and security and intelligence. Much lower, for example, when we ask about the government itself, the federal government, as well as provincial and territorial governments on aggregate and politicians. Most distrusted of all was media organizations in the US. But the key point here, again, is that in the citizen's eye view, the government is not one thing, and it can mean different things to different people. Now, why does trust matter? We argue that trust is not just an attitude that lives in people's heads. We're not just doing this for the sake of psychology. We think that trust and distrust matter for actual real-world policy-related behaviors. This is just one sort of simple upfront demonstration, at least in the context of a survey. So we've asked people how likely they would be to undertake different real-world actions or behaviors that are linked to different policy areas. So these are just theoretical behaviors. And we stratified people's self-rated likeliness to do this or to not do this based on their trust in the relevant government department or agency. So let's just take one example here, the middle one. In the event of another pandemic, would you get a new Health Canada approved vaccine as soon as it's available? I'll note here that according to public health experts, it's quite likely for most of us that we will live through another pandemic at some point in our lives. Sorry for triggering folks if you're not interested in thinking about that right now. But what we see is that self-rated intentions to get a new approved vaccine vary absolutely dramatically according to whether people say they trust or distrust the government on public health. So the fact that there's a difference here between the red bar for distrust, which is only about half the people saying they get a vaccine, and the blue bar for trust, which is almost everybody, the fact that there's a difference maybe is not surprising, but I think the magnitude of the difference speaks to the importance of trust. Now, it's not just trust in institutions that we're paying attention to. It's also trust and distrust in each other, because this matters for public policy, especially during collective action problems and collective crises, where my behavior affects your behavior and vice versa. So we've been measuring this idea of affective polarization for a little while. So affective polarization in the political science literature refers to something a little bit different from ideological polarization. So ideological polarization is about disagreement about policy issues. That's not what we're talking about here. Affective polarization refers to this more emotional dislike of or disgust with people who are on the other side of the political aisle, whatever that means for you. So those in the out group, you don't like them, you don't trust them, you can't be in a room with them. We measure this in a couple ways. I'll just cue your attention to the top here. For example, we can ask, how much do you trust or distrust people in Canada who share your political views versus those who have political views that are different from yours? And based only on this relatively subtle difference in language, we see basically a tenfold difference in rates of distrust. So again, the fact that there's a difference maybe isn't surprising, but it's quite a big difference. We also measure people's value judgments of those who do versus don't share their political views. And we can take these different data points and create a synthetic score for each of our many thousands of respondents, sort of quantify their individual level of affective polarization. And what we found since we started measuring this is that affective polarization is actually ticking up and up and up among adults in Canada, which is something that I think is concerning on its face and worth paying attention to. Now, what are people polarized about? Of course, there are any number of actual issues that are driving polarization. One relatively new one that I'll key in on as we close out this chapter, something that became an issue partway through this work, it was not on our radar 3 years ago, is support for Canada joining the US. What we've seen is that this level of support seems to have calcified among a non-trivial minority of adults in Canada. So let's unpack this. So we asked people, to what extent do you agree that Canada should become part of the US? And we just measure this on a scale going from strongly disagree to strongly agree. You can see here in the blue that 9% of adults in the country says that they think it would be a good thing for Canada to join the US. It was 9% in wave 8 of the Tide survey series, which was early 2025. That was closer in time to when these threats from over the border were actually sort of very salient. We thought that might change over time or retract back down, and it has not. So we found in our latest wave of tides, November 2025, that it was still 9%. So this seems to be, for now at least, a stable chunk of the population. Now, I want to unpack this attitude a little bit with a slightly complicated graph, but I'll walk you through it because I think it reveals an important phenomenon about public perceptions and social norms. So this is what we call the false consensus effect. And we see it in relation to all sorts of attitudes. Now, what you're looking at on the x-axis of the graph is each individual's own level of support for Canada joining the US. So these are the averages, strongly disagree, somewhat disagree, et cetera, et cetera. On the y-axis, what you're looking at is their estimate of how many other people in Canada, how many other adults in Canada think that Canada should join the US. So this is what you might call a social perception or a social consensus perception. We know that the true number is 9%, but what we see is this quite lawful relationship where the more strongly that one feels that Canada should join the US, the more dramatically they overestimate how many other people feel this way. And as I said, we see this in relation to all sorts of different policy attitudes. Speculatively, this could be linked to echo chambers online. It could be linked to algorithmic sorting of each of us into, ideological communities of people who feel the same way. But in any case, it illustrates that relatively small groups of people sometimes can, by virtue of their social perceptions, change their behavior. So that was just some scene setting on where we are as a country in terms of trust in institutions. Let's now move upstream and have a look at Canada's fragmented information ecosystems. So we've been finding over the course of the TIDES program of research that there are essentially 3 different information segments or clusters or bubbles in which Canadians live. So what you're looking at on the right is the output of a machine learning analysis approach, k-means clustering. And what we do, and we've been doing this for years, I should say, this is remarkably stable over time. It has not changed. What we do is we ask thousands and thousands of people to rate how frequently they use each of the following sources as a source of news and information about the world. Everything ranging from government sources, science experts, Canadian media, local media, US media, international media, politicians, independent commentators and podcasters, social media, and friends and family. And we let the analysis tell us, based on people's response patterns, what is the best way to chunk up the country into different sort of information segments? It could be 1 segment, it could be 10 segments. And then what are the characteristics of each segment? And we always find that there are 3, and they make up roughly 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 of the population writ large. So what we always find is that there's a low news consumption group here in pink, who are the lowest information consumers across the board, except when it comes to independent commentators and podcasters and social media. So the more sort of social sources. Then we've got a high traditional news group in light blue who disproportionately rely on traditional mainstream news sources, Canadian, local, US, international a little bit, and disproportionately avoid social media, for example, as a news source. This is by their own self-report. And then there's a high social sources group in dark blue who are the highest information consumers across the board, but by comparison to the other groups, especially high in their use of social media as a news source. So why am I telling you this? The short story is that what we find always is that these are essentially 3 different Canadas, if you will, and that where people live in information space in 2026 is likely as or more important than where they live in physical space. And this really materially impacts federal policy outcomes, communications, et cetera. So here are some examples. Let's just break down trust in the government, which I showed you before at the average level, by these 3 information buckets. And what you can see is dramatically different rates of trust. So the low news consumption group trusts the federal government, again, as a whole institution, not one party or another, at essentially half the rate of the other 2 groups. I'll note that there are some differences in demographics across the groups. For example, as you might suspect, the traditional news group tends to be a little bit older, a little bit higher income, but these differences are relatively subtle and we control for them statistically in these analyses. So everything I'm going to show you reveals a significant difference between information segments, even when controlling for age, education, income, etc. So very different rates of trust, and also totally different attitudes about institutions and democracy in general. So feeling that official government accounts of events cannot be trusted. Again, we see sort of a huge difference here, where the pink low news group feels this way at basically twice the rate of the other groups, including going beyond this even to things like agreement with pro-Kremlin adversarial narratives about the Russia-Ukraine war. I'm going to skip past how we measure this, just to say we lean on independent third-party researchers who have identified and vetted certain adversarial narrative statements. You can see dramatically different rates of agreement. Here, the high social sources group is also significantly higher than the traditional news group, feeling that our social institutions must be torn down, feeling that people in Canada with different political views are a threat to democracy. These attitudes predominate at very different rates, just depending on where people live in information space. Now, I want to dive deeper on social media here, because I think we all know at this point that social media is a big deal. I'll say when we started this research, I feel like I had to make that case a little bit more strongly, that social media mattered a lot for democracy, policy, the material well-being of Canadians, et cetera, et cetera. Here's just some descriptive data on how frequently people in Canada are using each of the major platforms. What you're looking at is the percentage of individuals who use each platform at least daily. It hasn't changed too much over time, except that Twitter, now X, use has declined a little bit. YouTube use has ticked up a little bit. Of note, what we find is that 82% of adults in Canada, so over 4 in 5, visit at least one of these platforms daily, and 1 in 5, 21%, spend many hours every single day on one of these platforms. I've included the little flags here representing who owns each of the platforms. Of course, we all know that none of the major platforms are owned by a Canadian. This is, a bit of a rhetorical device. I don't mean to imply too much. All this to say, as we've seen, certain platforms have become increasingly politicized over time. And so, again, this is something that's worth paying attention to in the public policy space. So here's one reason why, for example. What you're looking at here is a really large statistical model mapping the link between how much time people say they spend on each of the major social media platforms, and then their reactions to a bunch of policy-related mis- and disinformation claims. So verifiably true and false claims about domestic policy issues that we gather from third-party fact checkers, the same way that other academic studies do. What you can see is that it's a mixed picture here. So you're looking at the marginal link between another unit of time spent on, let's say, Reddit, for example, while controlling for time spent on all of the other platforms. And so the dots here are all over the place, which means that social media as a whole should probably not be treated as one thing. For example, another unit of time spent on Reddit in statistical terms is linked to significantly, subtly, but statistically significantly more resistance against misinformation, which would be measured as, less belief in the verifiably false claims, more belief in the verifiably true claims. TikTok and YouTube, both video-based, highly algorithmically personalized platforms, for example, are linked to the reverse pattern. So very subtle, but statistically significantly more belief in misinformation. And Twitter, now X, is the most interesting platform here. You can see that I've binned the data from sort of earlier data when we started this work, 2022, 2023, to slightly more recent data, 2023, 2024, black. And there was a significant shift over time. So time spent on Twitter/X used to be sort of like Reddit, linked to subtly more resistance against misinformation, and this substantially flipped over time. You might be asking when it flipped. We can actually look at this with the resolution of every few months of data collection. I'm not going to dwell on this. The key message is that these patterns are quite dynamic, but you can see that the so-called Twitter X effect sort of flips around the time of the ownership change at that platform. So I think this is an interesting example. It's just correlational. It is, again, controlling for age and gender and education and variables of the users themselves. But I think it's an example of how we can see near real-time changes in sort of public discourse and the effects of information technology on policy. Now, what could we do about any of this? Of course, people's beliefs and the platforms they visit are their own business. One angle that we've become interested in is people's literacy, and especially the idea of algorithmic literacy. So there's been a lot of chatter recently about digital literacy, but we want to go a little bit deeper and focus on people's basic awareness of how recommendation algorithms shape what they see online. And what we found, we came up with a little algorithmic literacy test, a little true-false test with 4 items. And we found that conservatively, a third of adults in Canada lack awareness of the basic ways in which recommendation algorithms shape online exposure. And I'm saying conservatively because 1/3 of the population is the number of people who explicitly got one of the questions wrong. There's actually far greater rates of people saying they don't know. So as one example, 14% of people in the country incorrectly think that if 2 people search the same thing on Google, they'll get the same results. That's not true. And what we see quite strikingly, I think, in relation to the misinformation measurement is that there's this quite clear relationship between algorithmic literacy and responses to policy-related mis and disinformation, where the better people do on the algorithmic literacy assessment, the lower the belief in verifiably false claims, the greater the belief in verifiably true claims. So I think this is probably, something worth knowing and maybe a call to action because in a truly nonpartisan sense, I think most people would agree people need to know the water that they're swimming in online and have some basic awareness. So I want to close this mini section on mis and disinformation on this idea that mis and disinformation is social. What do I mean by this? So here I'm going to show you, again, another example of the false consensus effect that I mentioned before. This work was done several years ago at this point, hence the focus on COVID and climate, which were key policy issues at the time. And on the x-axis, what you can see is the perceived accuracy of claims, so people's belief in true and false claims. On the y-axis, again, we're going to look at their estimates of how many other adults in Canada believe each claim. And this is what we see. So let's just focus on the left. When it comes to verifiably false claims, what we see is that those who are the most likely to see these claims as true, to believe them, to agree with them, dramatically overestimate how many other people also think they're true. So folks in this bucket here think that, almost half the population believes a given claim about COVID, public health, or climate, when in fact the rate is much lower. And this all raises a question. I'm now going to briefly delve into an interesting little experiment, randomized control trial that we ran to ask, what is the causal effect of social information, social consensus information, on reactions to policy-relevant information and misinformation? Behavioral economists, behavioral scientists have done many experiments on the question of social norms. If you just tell people about a social norm, how many people are doing or believing a given thing, this can actually causally affect their attitudes or behaviors. But to my knowledge, this has not been applied to the very fickle issue of misinformation. So let me walk you through what we did. We took a nationally representative sample of just over 3,000 adults in Canada. Excuse me for a second. And we had them rate the accuracy of a series of true and false claims about federal policy issues. And we randomized people into one of 2 conditions. One condition received social consensus information, which is just information about how many other Canadians believed a given claim, which was based on our own representative polling data. The other condition did not, the condition with the social information is below in red, and then the other condition in blue did not get social information. They just saw a claim and said, yeah, I'm sure this is true, I think it's true, or I think it's false, etc. So here's an example. Take a given claim. Immigrants who were not yet Canadian citizens were allowed to vote in the last federal election. This is referring to the 2021 election because this was done a few years ago. Both conditions see the exact same claim, except the social consensus information group gets this extra little bit of information saying, Public opinion research from the Government of Canada in December 2023 shows that 12% of adults in Canada think this claim is true. A very light touch experimental intervention, right? It's just some boring text about the percentage of other people that believe the claim. So here's the overly simple prediction. Social consensus information should tilt accuracy perceptions in the direction of the public consensus. And this is all premised on the interesting observation that the public consensus, the number of people who actually believe a given thing, tends on public issues to map to reality, or at least to map to independent, nonpartisan fact checkers because of the so-called wisdom of the crowds effect. So there's lots of papers on this. One interesting one from David Rand at MIT, basically showing if you sum up enough people, they sort of, on aggregate, behave like fact checkers. So did it work? Here, I'm going to show you the effect of the intervention on people's accuracy perceptions for true and false statements. So moving to the left would mean less belief. Moving to the right would mean more belief. So this is the treatment effect. And what did it work? Not really, but sort of, depending on your statistical conventions. In the aggregate, it did not significantly work, but you can see that there was a sort of what you might call a marginally significant effect on false statements, which is that providing social information marginally reduces people's belief in these false claims about policy issues. To understand this, I want to dig into the claim-by-claim heterogeneity. So I'm not going to go through all of these claims, but the key point here is that when you look at the effect of the intervention on all of these true and false claims, there is one claim where it worked very strongly, and it's this one. A cardiac unit in a Canadian children's hospital was expanded to treat COVID-19 vaccine side effects. This is not true. This was flagged by an interesting scraping tool on social platforms that was debunked, fact-checked false claims. You can see that the effect specifically worked for this claim. So what's different about this claim? I know this is probably too small for you to read, but I'm showing you here the distribution of rates of belief for a set of different false claims across the two groups. But for the quantitative folks on the call, if you just squint your eyes, I'll ask you, does one of these distributions not look like the other? The answer, of course, is that this one over here has a very different distribution. All the other claims load up on the left, which is to say the vast majority of people think the claims are false. This claim uniquely elicited a lot of uncertainty. So many people were saying, don't know, in response to this claim. And so the tentative conclusion from this sort of quite simple experiment is that social consensus information, or the wisdom of the crowds, so just information about what your compatriots, what other adults in the country are doing or believing in this case, may elicit a stronger effect on reducing belief in policy-related misinformation, specifically under conditions of greater initial uncertainty. So when something new is happening or people don't know what's going on, it might be useful to have a reliable estimate of how other people are seeing the issue. So that was a brief foray into Kenner's information space. I'm going to close the data story on this very brief chapter about citizen-government interactions, where trust is built, and then I will close with some applied recommendations. So first, what we found is that access to public services is robustly linked to higher trust in all orders of government, federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal, and this may be a precondition for trust. So here in this wave of tides, we counted up all of, for each participant, all of the different public services that they have access to and whether they're satisfied with those services. So this ranged from everything like libraries, doctors, childcare, public spaces, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see more access on the right, less access on the left. And what we see is that people who say they have more access to public services and they're more satisfied with them are robustly more likely to trust the government to make good decisions. And it doesn't matter if it's the federal government, the provincial territorial government, or the municipal government. It doesn't even matter which order of government is responsible for which service. It's just that people are more likely to trust public institutions and governments when they feel better served by these public institutions, which I think makes good sense. We dove deeper on this by asking specifically about people's interactions with the federal government. And what we see here is that those who are more satisfied with their last interaction with the government, so we just ask people to think, what's the last time you had any interaction with the government, be it taxes, border, policing, defense, parks, etc. And we see that trust is quite a bit higher for those who are very satisfied with their last interaction with the federal government compared to those who are very dissatisfied. And now we went even deeper on this and ran a little micro experiment again, asking people to either think about a positive or a negative interaction with government and whether they were satisfied with the process and whether they were satisfied with the outcome of that interaction. And here's what we found. We see that in both cases, whether we ask people to think about a positive interaction or a negative interaction, they are less satisfied with the process than they are with the outcome. So I think this is just an illustrative little point showing that perhaps improving government processes, interactions with citizens is going to be one key way to increase trust. And to wrap up this chapter, we can actually ask the public, hey, what would earn more public trust in the federal government? And then we can let them tell us, what they think would earn more trust. And we've listed out a ton of different options. These are just some of the top categories. We see, for example, in this particular wave, early 2025, that the top rated things the government could do to earn more trust from the public would be delivering on major promises and policy commitments, implementing measures to prevent government corruption, and more open communication about how federal government decisions are made. So again, a little bit of outcome, but a lot of emphasis on process. Okay, so to close, what can we do as behavioral scientists or behavioral economists or social scientists or data scientists to actually try to design for trust and earn trust? So we have developed, by turning to the literature here, a bit of a framework to think about how governments in general can design for trust. The key idea here is that public trust is negatively impacted by opaque, inscrutable, and ineffectual government systems, programs, and communications, and every interaction with citizens is an opportunity to earn trust or to lose it. Key message is that, all institutions, I think this holds for companies as well, need to essentially look inwards at your own levers of control and ask, what can you change about your behaviors, the behaviors of government, the behaviors of an organization to earn greater trust in the public? We've boiled down the different sort of levers here to ability, doing a good job, basically, care, showing care and concern for citizen well-being, and integrity, so being honest with values and transparent with the process. So I'm going to quickly give you an example of some work we've done on ability and integrity, and then I will wrap up. So on ability, I want to highlight the work that we've done to reduce government sludge. I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with sludge. I recall former director of Bayer, Dilip Soman, gave a great talk to our group about sludge years ago. So sludge refers to the undue barriers and frictions in a process that impose undue costs, time, effort, money. So all organizations have a lot of sludge, and we want to identify it and get rid of it. So we have developed a made in Canada sludge audit approach, basically to identify where the sludge exists in federal processes and systems and touch points with citizens, identify it, and then redesign to make processes more streamlined, cheaper, faster, better. I won't dwell on the steps here. I want to quickly highlight that sludge is not exclusively an external facing, citizen facing issue. So a lot of sludge reduction efforts focus on the impact of regulation or service design on citizens and businesses, the sort of red tape that people have to go through. This matters, but it's also complemented by a lot of internal sludge. So this is sludge that's, not visible to citizens, but, administrative hurdles and burdens inside of the system that are slowing things down. And so the message here is that outward simplification, so just making things more streamlined for customers, consumers, citizens, may inadvertently just transfer complexity inside the system, and result in what's the so-called beige tape, so this kind of internal-facing administrative sludge. So we need to deal with both of these. These are some quick examples of major sludge audits undertaken by the very talented folks on my team in the Impact and Innovation Unit. For example, we did a sludge audit on employee requests for accommodations. We highlighted ways in which this was sort of taking more time and costing a lot more than it needed to. So that could result in speeding up this important process. Getting major projects built faster. So speeding up federal impact assessments and permitting to reduce duplication, cut steps, improve coordination, and basically build bigger and faster. And lastly, a good example of internal sludge, the Treasury Board submission review. This is very inside baseball government stuff. But the key point here is that we conducted a sludge audit to reduce administrative burden and improve efficiency in these Treasury Board reviews that impact sort of how and when departments get their work done. So not citizen facing, but with the potential to dramatically speed things up across the whole system. So that was an example of ability. Lastly, I'll show you a quick example of an experiment we ran to demonstrate this idea of integrity or transparency. And that was specifically demonstrating this concept of operational transparency. We did this several years ago in the space of social media messaging about COVID vaccines, but I think the message applies broadly even today. So operational transparency refers to disclosing the behind-the-scenes work that an organization undertakes through its operating process that's usually opaque and kept invisible to citizens or customers, et cetera. This was an experiment in fall 2021 with about 1,500 COVID unvaccinated adults in Canada. And it was looking at the government's Twitter messaging campaign about vaccines. So we took the actual status quo Twitter messaging campaign at the time, which is over here. This is our active control group. And we compared it to some alternative messaging campaigns that we developed in-house, exemplifying this idea of operational transparency. So for example, the benefits outweigh the risks messaging campaign did not tell people the benefits outweigh the risks. It just transparently laid out, here are the benefits, here are the risks of vaccination, make up your own mind. The success funnel campaign showed all of the different vaccines that were tested at different points and how we wound up with the final few that were rolled out and scaled up to the public. We also compared these to a passive control condition where people didn't see any social media messaging at all. So couple quick results. First, communications can backfire. So here we're looking at vaccine intentions on the y-axis, and you can see that the passive control group actually had higher vaccine intentions than the active group. So what does this mean? This means that people seeing no messaging at all was actually better than them getting the status quo messaging. So the status quo messaging actively repelled or reduced vaccine intentions, at least specifically in this sample of unvaccinated Canadians. It doesn't mean that this messaging campaign backfired in the entire population, just that it may have backfired here. When we look at the operationally transparent messaging conditions, we see that all four of them elicited significantly higher vaccine intentions than the status quo condition. On the left, you can see this in absolute terms on the vaccine intention scale. On the right, we've transformed the data so you can see the effect of the conditions compared to the control. So 0 would be no effect. On average, these conditions elicited about an 8% increase in vaccine intentions, which, if scaled up, if this generalized, would have a big impact on public health outcomes. Now, the most successful campaign was that success funnel tweet thread that I mentioned before that shows the different vaccines that were tested. So the key point here is that showing the behind-the-scenes work that goes into ensuring vaccines are safe, or by implication, the behind-the-scenes work for any public policy is more effective than simply telling citizens that this is the case. So it's the old adage of show, don't tell. So apologies for going a little long here. I'll wrap up with some quick summary points. First, good public policy requires measuring and elevating dynamic citizen perspectives and priorities. There is no average citizen, so we need to use our data science lens to get beyond the average. And we need to understand the intervening information ecosystem, either between governments and citizens, companies and customers, so on and so forth. And behavioral science must look inward at the behaviors of government or institutions and earn trust by demonstrating trustworthiness. Sludge audits and operational transparency are just two examples here. And lastly, the key message I want to leave for all of you here is that the toolkits of social science, behavioral economics, et cetera, and data science have a key role to play in government. I've given you an overview of just some of the work that the unit's done. There's tons more. If you're interested in this kind of work, please ask me about it or reach out. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. That was fascinating. You did cover quite a bit of ground, so I'm excited about all of that. I'll leave a couple of minutes for people to bring up the Q&A. We probably have time for maybe 2 questions. So I want to get started with something that I was thinking of is the cause and effect here. So do you view public trust as a cause or an effect of successful public policy? For example, during times of crisis, how should I think about that through the lens of your work?
Yeah, excellent question. Cop-out answer is that, but the true answer, I think, is that it's both.
Mhm.
So I think there's a risk of seeing public trust as something institutions need. It's like, hey, we want to boost trust so that policy outcomes will be better and people will sort of support these policies. Um, that may be true, but it's very incomplete. Public trust, of course, is an outcome of public policy. So I think about two scholars here. One is the economist Darren Acemoglu. I may be butchering the pronunciation of his name.
Oh,
Nobel
I know
Prize
that's
winning
right.
guy.
Yeah.
So he has this great work on the idea that successful democracies breed their own trust by demonstrating their success. And I also think of the political scientist Pippa Norris. So my team thinks about this framework that Dr. Norris has a lot, showing the relationship between the performance of governments and the trust of the people. And the key point is that what we want in any country, I'm not talking about Canada, I'm talking about in the abstract, what we want is skeptical trust. We want citizens to trust the government, but because we want them to trust the government because of, great performance and transparency, et cetera. We don't just want credulous trust, which would be trust regardless of performance. So trust is both, I think, a cause and an outcome here.
Awesome. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like, yeah, trust but verify kind of thing, which I
Mhm.
think it makes a lot of sense. We have a question in the chat from Vicky Rubio. Are there any insights or data identifying the most trusted platforms for publishing credible information? Additionally, does publishing on platforms where misinformation exists affect perceived reliability?
That's a fantastic question. So we could talk for hours about platforms and misinformation. It's a really difficult issue. There are major definitional issues. We try to hew to the highest sort of rigorous research practices in this space, but it's tricky. So to the first question, I'm not aware of data of how much people trust each of the different platforms. It seems like an obvious question, but I've never really thought about it. Of course, there's lots of data on use. You might say that use is sort of like the behavioral manifestation of trust. You wouldn't use it if you didn't trust it. But I don't actually think that's true. I personally spend way too much time on platforms that I don't trust because, they're addictive and they're fun and they're distracting. Um, so it would be interesting to get those data, but I would wonder what they would tell us. There may be platforms that are massively distrusted, but they may be extremely popular. So what would we make of that? Second, is there liability for, let's say, public institutions to be like to be active in spaces where there's a lot of disinformation or problematic discourse? It's a good question. I don't want to speak on behalf of the government or any department. My view, having looked at these data for years and spoken to other researchers and folks in other governments and institutions, is that being passive because you're not happy with the state of the discourse is probably not a winning strategy. There is a massive competition for influence and trust and attention all the time. And basically, if you don't get in the game, then you can't compete, and you sometimes just lose by default. So that's a high level view I have. I think when it comes to specific institutions and specific communications goals, this may vary, of course. But the key message here is it's knowable. You can do message testing, you can collect good data to understand the environment that you might play in.
Great. So we have another question in the chat that I'll read. That question is, how have you changed your behavior based on all the data you've seen about the public, or what opinions have surprised you? I also wanted to give me maybe a couple minutes at the end. We only have maybe 5 minutes left. I think this is a great opportunity, given your path that began in academia, and now you're in a very important political office where you're doing fantastic research. So I'd love if you could maybe wrap up it with a couple of minutes telling us about how do you view the bridge? I don't know if we have too many PhD students on the call, but we certainly have people who advise students.
Mm.
So how would you kind of talk to students? Because it seems like there's all these great research positions in places where traditionally they might not have been. So I'd love for you to answer Jocelyn's question and then also
Mhm.
give us a little bit about that aspect of your career training.
Okay, I'll try to be super quick in the interest of time. First, I just want to clarify, I'm not in a political office per se. I'm in
Sure,
the,
sorry.
no,
Apolitical,
yeah,
absolutely.
nonpartisan public service,
For sure.
a humble public servant. So, man, the first question's great. Like, how have I changed my behavior personally as an individual? I'm going to be thinking about that all day. But the first thing that came to mind is that I think I have well, to be totally honest, it may sound silly. I've become more patriotic. I was postdocing in the States for a while. As an academic, I felt very unanchored to a specific place. You never know where you might wind up. I am from Canada, and it's been a real joy to get to know Canada better. And that's one way I've changed. I also think that I've become less, uh, I, I'm more appreciative of, I take a sort of ecological view of public opinion. I feel a little bit less polarized and hot and angry on certain issues myself. I feel more in touch with like the very valuable diversity of opinion that exists. And I think about things more in that way, sort of bird's eye view. And I know that my own information consumption is extremely biased because everybody's is. So those are three examples. As for the second question, um, short story is if there are any PhD students or advisors of PhD students, if you asked me in my PhD or even in my postdoc until just about the last few months, if I would ever want to be in government, the answer would be no the entire time, probably emphatically. I didn't know what it would mean to do this kind of research in government. I was doing neuroscience studies, I was studying memory. So, it turns out that a lot of the skills I was building were way more widely useful than I thought. Um, I appreciate that now. And B, um, I would want to tell people who are like, scholarly folks, love the process of science, reading literature, thinking hard. Um, you can really scratch that itch and have like a super intellectually satisfying, hypothesis exploring kind of life in the public service, responding to like national issues, national crises. I've found this genuinely like really cool. That's my message.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nick. So a few more questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to, but we can forward those to you. And I encourage everyone to reach out to Nicholas individually. So, that concludes our webinar for today. It's been great having Dr. Nicholas Diamond with us. And this is actually the last Bear webinar of this academic year. So we'll see you all in the fall. A full recording of this webinar and all previous webinars are available on our website by clicking the tab labeled webinars. So again, thank you, Nicholas, for being here. Thank you for everyone who joined today and throughout the year. It's been so much fun attending these, and we'll definitely, hopefully, see all of you in the fall. We wish you all a great day, and we'll see you guys around. Take care, everyone.
Thanks very much.